Scout of the Endless Frontier, Episode 5, The Valley of Quiet Dreams, written and read by Elton Gar. Rust had been significantly more patient than Elias could have reasonably expected. The dog had remained calm and happy for the first 2 weeks he had been unable to leave the Ghost Wake, only beginning to show the first signs of frustration around the time Elias had found the Shoreland ship. The Shoreland had left Elias a treasure trove of supplies, but Rust couldn't go into the damaged ship, so Elias spent most of a week leaving the Ghost Wake every few hours, then returning with armloads of stuff Rust wasn't even allowed to play with. By the second day of that, Rust began to bark at Elias every time he left the ship, and by the end of the week he barely even acknowledged Elias when he fed him and ignored him the rest of the time. The dog needed fresh air and someplace to run. Under normal circumstances, Elias would have just picked a well-scouted world and landed for a few weeks. But he was deep in the wilds of space. There were no colonies or scouted worlds, so he picked a star with a wide and stable habitable zone, warned Rust that they might not find anything, then set a course. Even the attempt seemed to placate Rust, who, after some prompting, played with his ball for a few minutes and showed genuine interest in something for the first time in days when Elias opened one of the storage containers. According to the scans, the food inside was a superfood with a tremendous amount of calories and nutrients. That was good, because it had the consistency and flavor of overcooked rice. Not entirely offensive, but not something he'd ever be excited to eat. And when he put a spoonful into Rush's dish, the dog just sniffed it, then huffed and walked away. A day later they arrived at the system. It had 7 planets. The first of those worlds was little more than a large scorched rock. That was pretty typical. The second was on the outer edge of the habitable zone, but with a thick enough atmosphere to make up for that. And as they approached, the sensors found not only the signs of life, but radiation in the atmosphere that could have only been created by the explosion of nuclear weapons. But, well, that wasn't the best sign. There wasn't a lot of radiation. Someone had set off a few bombs most of a century before. Humans had done the same thing, but then, instead of acting rationally and vowing to never do it again, humans had spent most of the next century playing childish games of brinkmanship. But in Elias's experience, humans were less rational than most spacefaring species, probably because all the less rational species had blown themselves up. Getting nearer the world, he began to get more worried about this place. All the signs were of a civilization that had disappeared 100 years ago. There were hints of pollution, but nothing new. There were cities, but they were covered in plant life. The Ghost Wake found nothing dangerous to humans, and Elias hated an unsolved mystery. So, he began to look for the best place to land. After all, if the civilization here was dead, how dangerous could they possibly be? After a few flyovers, he picked a large valley with a city by a large lake. It was the type of place that he might choose to live, given the chance. But, more importantly, the city was big enough to have clues to what happened, while not being large enough for him to expect any major surprises. But he didn't go to the city first. He was curious, but not stupid, and, for now, the most important thing was getting Rust outside. So he landed in a village barely big enough to be called a village. There was a single large building, and a few smaller ones he assumed were homes, stretched out along the edge of the lake. It was as empty as any place else, though Elias simply landed on the large road that weaved through the town. There were cracks in the road that plants were growing up in, and every yard was overgrown with plants. But Rust didn't care about any of that, and as soon as the door of the Ghost Wake opened, he shot out. Elias circled the Ghost Wake slowly and carefully. It was always vital to secure your ship, and it kept him close in case something went wrong. As he made the circle, he eyed the only large building in the area. It had a large sign in an alien script in front of it. That was a business of some type, and likely the corporate headquarters of the area. If there was any clue as to what happened to this world, that would be where he would find it. Rust appeared out of the thick grass as Elias walked towards the building. He had a 100-year-old toy animal in his mouth, and was clearly proud of his discovery. As Elias approached the building, he saw birds flying above him and several small animals chattering in the trees. This was a living world. Only the dominant species had disappeared. He stepped inside the building and couldn't help but laugh. For the first time in years, the ghost wake had a full hold, and he immediately found a building with shelves filled with food. A lot of it was bad, of course. This place had been abandoned for a long time, but a surprising amount of it looked safe to eat. He moved slowly through the store. He couldn't be entirely certain it was abandoned, but he also felt no rush. The plan was to spend weeks here, a plan that would be easier if he took his time doing things. As he moved towards the exit, he saw something out of the corner of his eye. He pretended not to see it and moved outside, then put his back to the wall and waited. Rust followed, running into the deep grass, the toy still in his mouth. Whatever was inside didn't follow. Elias waited, his hand on the talon. He had carried the plasma pistol through the war and trusted it, but he also knew that patience was a far more dangerous weapon. He waited almost 3 minutes before he spotted another movement, someone peeking out from the corner of the building. And, while it might be dangerous, he was the outsider here. So, he called out in his most calming and friendly voice, "I'm not here to hurt anyone." There was another moment of silence, and he feared he might have made a mistake. Then someone walked around the edge of the building. Based on the size of the buildings and the shelves, it was a child. She was also carrying a toy doll. It was similar to the one that Russ had found, its arm dragging on the ground as she approached cautiously. She was covered in mud and dust. Her hair, in different shades of black, white, and brown, was wild and unkempt. She made it halfway to Elias before her nerves gave out, and she stopped and began to cry. Elias started to turn to help her, but before he had moved, Rust approached her. The girl, terrified, tried to back up. She fell, and then, sitting on the ground, began to cry harder as Rust began to lick her face. After a few seconds, she stopped crying. Once she was calm, Rust sat so that his head was only a few inches in front of hers. She said something that seemed more excited than upset. If it was a human language, Elias suspected it may have been doggy. She then reached out and touched one of Rust's ears. It was, in many ways, similar to the floppy ears on the side of her head. Taking his hand away from the talon, Elias opened one of the other pockets on his belt. He only had a couple of energy bars left, but he wasn't going to starve, so he walked over to the girl and held it out. She snatched it out of his hand and stuck it in her mouth, a bit too fast. She was thin, not sickly thin, but he doubted she had been eating well. She then stood up, squared herself, grabbed 2 of Elias's fingers, and began to pull him towards something. Rust moved with them only a few inches from the young child, his eyes swinging around looking for any sign of danger, as his ears went up and his tail went stiff. He didn't bark or give Elias any reason to believe there was actually any danger. He was just being cautious. Elias felt the same way. There was just something about a lost child that went past species. It was the same reason he hated himself so much for what he had done in the war, and he tried to pretend that if he could help this one girl, it might make him feel better. But he had helped lots of people, and it still didn't drive out the images of the eggs and the children that he had helped to kill. She pulled him towards a home. Elias feared what he would find inside, but mostly it was just a house. The main room had wide open windows with clear glass covered in dust, and while everything was old, it seemed like it had been well made and well organized. It had none of the technological devices you'd expect in a Commonwealth home, but that also meant it wouldn't be full of things controlling and spying on you. The girl didn't stop in the living room. Instead, she led him down a short hallway to a bedroom. There were 2 people in the bed, both significantly bigger than the girl, with the same multicolored hair and floppy ears. There was also a blanket and a pillow on the floor, with a few toys scattered around it. This girl had been on her own for a while. His first assumption was that the 2 people in the bed were dead. But they weren't. They were asleep. And they had been for a long time. Probably 100 years. His best guess, and it was a guess, was that a pandemic had hit this world, one that had kept people alive, but also put them to sleep. He wasn't a doctor, and the only group he knew who might be able to help was Vitalis Health Consortium. They weren't here, but he did have an autodock made by them in his ship. So that was a risk. The last time he had used the autodock, it had almost entirely locked him out of the Ghostwake systems until he saw a doctor. If it did that again, he'd be in trouble. Or it might cure the disease and have no reason to trigger that failsafe. Either way, when he glanced at the small girl who was still holding his hand, he didn't see how he had any choice. She was talking now. Not a lot, but you didn't have to know her language to know she was asking for help. And he could help, so, if he didn't, he would never forgive himself. He bent down, scooped her up, and said, "I'm going to have to take you to my ship." She tried to wiggle free as he walked out of the room, and he considered for a moment leaving her and going back to the ship alone. But he needed someone who had the disease, and she was the easiest option. The girl calmed when she saw the ghost wake. She likely had no idea what it was, but Rust was running up to it, and she seemed to have decided she liked Rust. Her eyes widened as Elias brought her onto the ship. He had to put her down as he moved the piles of spherical containers he had piled onto the autodock, tossing them onto the floor since the rest of the ship was already filled. While he was doing that, Russ brought over his blue ball, and the girl picked it up. Then, in some non-verbal communication that always seemed to happen between dogs and children, began to throw the ball. That kept both of them happy until the autodock was ready. Then Elias put the girl into the device. Almost as soon as she was laying down, she fell asleep. At first, he assumed the autodock had given her something to put her to sleep, but the records didn't show that. She was just exhausted. She had been on her own for who knew how long. If the disease slowed her aging as well, it might be the entire 100 years, though he suspected it hadn't been that long. Over the next hour, the system scanned her with tools he barely understood, took blood, skin samples, hair samples, and more, and then it printed out a long list of information. It all boiled down to her being healthy. That was good to know, and according to the printout, she developed antibodies for the disease about 6 months ago. That was better. He didn't love that she had been alone for 6 months, but that was far better than he had assumed. Even more valuable, the solution was simple. If he took her blood and injected it into her parents, there should be almost no chance of rejection, and the antibodies would wake them up in a few days. During those days, the girl seemed to come alive. Unlike Elias, she seemed to actually enjoy the odd, tasteless paste from the spherical container, though she enjoyed the last of his energy bars more. Mostly, she just played with Rust, and the two were running around in a field of tall grass when someone came out of her house. It was the smaller of her two parents. He assumed her mother. She yelled something and rushed out and snatched the girl off the ground, putting herself between the girl and both Rust and Elias. The girl began to talk and point, and after a short conversation, the woman answered in a deeper tone, then put the girl down. She walked over to Elias. He held still, not sure what she was doing. She then leaned forward, putting her forehead against his for a moment, and grabbed both of his shoulders. Then, after a few seconds, stood up straight, adjusted her hair, and walked over to the girl and began to talk. The father woke up a few hours later. He was even more defensive when he saw both Rust and Elias. But he talked to his wife, then gave Elias the same gesture she had. He assumed it was a thank you, though he couldn't be sure. Showing the adults how to spread the cure was a bit more tricky. But once they understood, they took him to the store and found a large box of needles, and took him to another house, this one bigger than theirs. From the reaction of the man when he woke, it was likely the town healer, perhaps a doctor, though it was a small town, so he doubted it was anyone that important. A couple of days after that, the healer came into the town center. There were a few others awake by then. He wore a backpack and carried a walking stick. They hadn't been able to get any of the vehicles in the town working, but they must be thinking the same thing he was. There were people all over this world who needed help. Rather than make him walk several days, Elias took the man on a quick trip in the Ghostwake to one of the biggest cities he had found. It was 1,000 miles away, but even Rust didn't seem to mind the trip. And it seemed safe to assume that in a few months or years, this world would be awake again, though he suspected it would be far longer before it returned to normal. And he doubted it would ever be fully the same. From what the Autodoc said, the antibodies only stopped the sleeping sickness. The healing from it would remain, so they were likely to live for centuries or longer. With that done, he almost left. But Russ really needed more of a vacation. He had been alone for years, with the only ones to talk to the human who barely played with him and a plant in a terrarium. So, he landed the ship and let the dog go play for a few more days, while he pulled out a pack of cards to try to explain poker to people who didn't speak his language. Author's note. The lore of this series is important to me, but so is having a good solid adventure. And I think in the last few episodes I may have leaned a bit too far into the overarching story. So, I wanted something that's almost entirely independent from the rest of the narrative. The other thing I wanted to bring up was this month's theme. I made the mistake of picking the theme without considering the idea that I was going to be writing stories and the same series for the entire month. That doesn't mean I haven't tried to include that theme, just that it wasn't as strong as it might have been otherwise. And I stretched it a bit a couple of times. But this week, I think having a child alone worked well. I bring that up because the poll for next month's theme is out, and my intent is for it to be a larger part of the focus. Beyond that, I'm expanding out the stories I'm writing by creating 2 more series that will be in the same universe as Scout of the Endless Frontier. The first will be a series of stories from different places and time in the Commonwealth called Tales from the Commonwealth. There'll be background characters or events or simply interesting stories, and most of them will be patron exclusives. The other series is unnamed, but it'll be a more traditional space opera with a starship and crew. What makes it interesting to me is that it's Star Trek set in a corporate oligarchy, and the ship itself is run by a group of corporations, but also far enough out that at least sometimes the crew can choose to do the right thing over the profitable one. So, come and vote for the next month's theme at patreon.com/Elton. Anyone can vote. Thank you. Elton Gar.